Freddie Forsyth. We were young reporters in the BBC in 1964. He was the assistant diplomatic correspondent. No disparagement to all the rest of us, but our star turn in many ways is Frederick Forsyth. He has and deserves an entire chapter to himself. Better known these days as a brilliant thriller writer, but where did he get it from? Our former assistant diplomatic correspondent, the man who was assigned by the BBC to cover the Nigerian civil war, and for one reason or another he did, and he was, can we say, reduced to the ranks, and he was busted to be a general reporter like me, and I've always thought, of all the journalists I've known, I'm Kurt Schork, all kinds of wonderful people, I know nobody who ever showed more moral and physical courage than the old guy in the white suit here. Freddie, can you keep it less than half an hour, please? Can you briefly say what happened to you and what you now think?
Yeah, I'll keep it as succinct as I can. Well, as to crossing a line, I've actually crossed 3 lines. The first one was when I accepted the post of assistant diplomatic correspondent of the BBC at the age of 28, which is unnaturally young, and for some offensively young. And I didn't realise I had made quite a number of enemies inside the hierarchy. A slight digression, if I may, the so-called British establishment. It's once said of the devil that the most cunning thing he ever did was to deny he existed. MI6 used to be exactly like that, not well, we remember best when there was apparently no secret intelligence service in Britain. Now, of course, we not only know that there is, we know where it is, we know who the boss is, but there was this, we remember when this was terra incognita. But anyway, there is a British establishment, denied though it may be. I, at 28, did not realise how cynical, how manipulative, and when crossed, how cruel it could be. I learned later, the hard way. That was the first line. What I had done inadvertently was to join the establishment. What I was not prepared to do, and didn't realise that it was assumed I had done it, was serve it. And that was where the second line got crossed. The second line was when I realised that I was going to be asked to participate in managed news, that the output on that subject, Nigeria Biafra, from the BBC was strongly biased in favour of the establishment, which insisted on a very strongly pro-Nigerian federal bias in all its agendas. That was when I walked. I should have given 3 months' notice. I didn't. I actually walked on a Friday night. I wrote my letter of resignation. I posted it in the late night mail, knowing it would arrive on Monday. On the Saturday I flew to Portugal, and on the Sunday I hitched a lift, squatting on a cargo of mortar bombs into Biafra. I had actually come back to where I'd started, but I hadn't come back as the BBC's assistant diplomatic correspondent. I'd come back as a self-declared rebel. The third time I crossed the line was absolutely deliberate, but it wasn't about Biafra or the political faring or fortunes of the former eastern region of Nigeria, which is a highly political question and didn't really, I felt, concern me. I crossed the line when I realized that the children were dying, and they were dying in large and increasing numbers. They weren't dying of bullets. There were some who died of bullets, of bombs, but they were the minority. This was, in my view, a deliberately concocted and organized famine. We've seen famines since, that normally when the crops fail, when the rains don't come, or possibly there's an earthquake or a volcano or an inundation of some kind, and people starve. But this was deliberate. This was in the manner of those organized famines that Stalin organized, for example, in the Kuban and the Black Earth country. The children began to die in Biafra about April 1968. Now, the war began on July the 7th, 67. So these are two issues. And it was about late March, April, some of the mothers in the deep bush began to present themselves at clinics run mainly by the Catholic missionaries, carrying with them their rather deformed children. They were deformed not because they were born that way, but they had been reduced to stick insects with lolling heads and unglazed eyes and big bloated, but only air-bloated bellies. And the mothers couldn't understand why this was happening. They said that they fed them regularly. And they did indeed, but what they were feeding them was gari, which is pounded cassava, and yams, both of which will fill you up, but they have got not 1 milligram of vitamins or calories inside them. They are carbohydrates. And this was a starvation caused by a complete lack of any kind of sustenance. Children need 5 grams a day of pure protein, and adults 1. That's why the children died. The story wasn't a story then. Biafra was, so to speak, the non-story. The Western world was concerned with many things, principally Vietnam, but this systematic destruction of a people who were part of the Commonwealth was a non-story. A group of journalists came down from Britain in the May of that year and for the first time saw and took pictures. And it was those pictures that transformed the story. And I found myself willy-nilly the resident, so to speak. I'd arrived in February, and I stayed until Christmas Eve '69. So in all 2 years, 3 months as a servant of the BBC, and then the rest of the time, 21 months as a freelance. In the sense that, yes, I did everything I could to try and raise awareness levels and possibly donation levels because of the plight of those children. I have absolutely no hesitation in pleading guilty, and proud of it. So 3 lines. I didn't mean to become a member of the establishment, but I absolutely refused to become its servant. I did mean to leave the BBC because it was either that or become part of a structure that I felt was parlaying managed news. And I definitely changed across the line when I decided to do all I could, not much. Freelancers are pretty way down the pecking order, but nevertheless do what I could to raise awareness levels inside and outside this country and eventually across Europe and North America for the plight of those children. Well, as it happened, 500,000 at least died, and the war, as you know, eventually ended in the crushing of the insurrection. But there's one thing that has stuck with me ever since, and it is my belief that it's one of the most shameful episodes our normally humane country and normally humane government have ever participated in, for this reason. If you take, as one must, that the secession, the UDI of the eastern region of Nigeria was illegal, then the Biafrans throughout the whole duration of that conflict were Nigerians. The government of Nigeria, therefore, was killing its own citizens. Secondly, the government of Nigeria was not a democracy. It was a very violent military junta that had come to power through an extremely violent coup d'etat in July 1966. You may like to ask yourself a rhetorical question: when in our long history has our government ever assisted a dictatorship to kill its own citizens? And the answer is never, save once. And the second question you might care to ask is why? Why did we assist a government that was no better than Bashar al-Assad to slaughter its own citizens for the crime of going into insurrection against them after numerous persecutions? Why did we do it? I know the answer. It was because of the massive vanity of the senior mandarins of the civil service who could not and would not be proved wrong. And that, I think, is shameful. I've never forgotten, I've never forgiven. Sorry, too long.
One of the most gifted, bloody-minded journalists I ever met was Freddie Forsyth. Freddie, some closing thoughts.
Yeah. Well, yes. I don't think there's probably any major story that you can cover which is completely devoid of any bias at all. It's extremely hard to avoid bias. I think Reuters, which I worked for 4 years, does a pretty bloody good job of not being biased. But there's almost always two sides to every story. There was a Serbian defence side, if you like. They too had atrocities committed by Croats against them. There were, yes, I'm sorry to say to the lady at the back, there is a case for Israel. The only creed I ever came across which had absolutely no mitigating factor whatsoever was Nazism. As a kid born in 1938 and raised through the war and after the war, obviously I knew a bit about it, and it was very nasty. It wasn't until I investigated it more deeply when I was researching the Odessa file that I found out exactly how foul it was. And most things you can say, well, maybe there's one mitigating factor, not that one. That's the only one. This has got nothing. Not even communism, can have a case made for it. But as to working for or rebelling against the establishment, I mean, sometimes I think that the establishment is not the friend of dispassionate reporting. It can't be, because it wants its version, to dominate, and that could well be the wrong version. One last anecdote, if I may. I was well smeared by the Foreign Office publicity department when I was out of the country. Obviously, I was down in the bush, but they had a good go at me. I became a mercenary. I became Ojukwa's personal advisor, which I wasn't. We chatted, but I wasn't his advisor. No, I wasn't a mercenary. I was an arms dealer. No, I wasn't an arms dealer. There was many things, but I was apparently all of these things. So when I came back, I was so well smeared that the only chance I had, I'm talking about the early spring of 1970, of getting a job in journalism was a pretty faint hope. So Neil Desperandum, I sat down and wrote a thing called The Day of the Jackal. And when it was published, I walked past the Foreign Office and I went, and I have a mental image. Thank you. Lots of little youngsters going back and saying, "Sir, there's a man outside on Whitehall raising a middle finger at us."
Thank you all for coming. It's a terrific book. I think it's on sale. I think it's been really useful, and my thanks to all the panelists, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much.